Slavery has been a universal institution for thousands of years, as far back as you can trace human history. And what we're looking at is if slavery is something that happened to one race of people in one country, when in fact the spread of it was around the world. In 1776, which is when Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, as well as when the United States got started, he said that Western Europe is the only place in the world where there is no slavery. And even the Western Europeans had vast numbers of slaves in the Western Hemisphere,
yes.
but not in Western Europe itself. And so if you're going to have reparations for slavery, it's going to be the greatest transfer of wealth back and forth. Because the number of whites, for example, who were enslaved in North Africa by the Barbary pirates exceeded the number of Africans enslaved in the United States and in the American colonies before that put together. But nobody is going to North Africa to ask for reparations because nobody is going to be fool enough to give it to them.
Okay, let's talk about reparations. So my brother wanted me to talk about reparations. And you know what? At first I was like, I got to do some research on this, but I did some research and now I think I'm going to talk about it. So Greg, if you're ready to challenge me, let's go. I'm against reparations. And the reason why I'm against reparations is for a host of reasons. But I think we need to go back to slavery. So everybody thinks that because blacks were slaves, that's why we should get reparations. The reparations actually started when blacks were free and the government gave land, promised land to blacks, the 40 acres and a mule. They promised them land, gave them a place, and said, if you continue doing like cotton and tobacco and things like that, we will pay you. You sell it to us and we will pay you. So they were free and they were business owners, but the government screwed them over. And then what would happen is the people that the former slaves or free slaves that they gave these lands to could not pay the mortgage. And then instead of them, working with those free slaves, they arrested them and then made them do free labor because now they're in jail. It was a very crooked thing. So that's where the reparations come from, not because you were a slave and so forth, because slavery goes back. White people were slaves and everybody was slaves. So if you want to go there, I think white people could go to Africa because there was some in the, I can't remember that, they were slaves in the African area and through Europe and everything. So, if we're going to say, pay us, they can also. It has to do with the 40 acres and a mule. That's where the reparations come from and why people are saying, where's our money? But in today's society, nobody wants to work. They just want this reparation, and thinking they're going to get millions. And it's crazy. But, before I go on with the pros and cons of reparations, mostly cons, I wanted to talk about the slave trade. So you had the North American slave trade, and then you had the Arabian slave trade. And now the North American slave trade, which I could be wrong, but I believe the Spaniards were collecting slaves and then bringing them over to America and sold them, and that's how the whole system was working. The Arabs were doing the same thing. Now, the Arabs were different because they started slavery way back then, and it continued on into the 21st century. Arabs were still holding blacks as slaves. It's crazy out in Africa. Yes, up to today, or maybe it could have ended, but up to the 21st century, Arabs were still holding blacks as slaves. So you have the Arabs. And it's not proven, but I do believe at one point, nobody was kidnapped and forced out. They were traded. The African leaders traded their people for wine, whatever, guns, things like that. Those slaves walked, for the North American slave trade, they walked onto that ship. They happily walked on. Now, after getting on the ship was a different story, but they had no clue that they were about to become slaves. They just knew that they were going off with these people. They probably thought that they were going somewhere it was going to be, and, and Lord behold, they became slaves. The Arabs was trading too. And then after a while, when the African leaders wanted to stop the slave trade, now this isn't proven, but I've heard it from other stories. The Arabs began kidnapping Africans. Now the Arabs were cruel. I mean, the Americans back then was whipping and cutting off feet and so forth, and doing so much things to them, especially if a black African was caught sleeping with a white woman, they would either kill him, whip him to death, or castrate him. The Arabs immediately castrated black men, and they impregnated the African women. So any African man that became a slave to Arabs, they were automatically castrated. There was no ifs, ands, buts. They got castrated. So I think it's time that people really start understanding their history and start learning about the slave trade, especially the North American and the Arab slave trade, because blacks here today keep thinking that we were kidnapped and like we were the only slaves ever, and not realizing that there were white slaves, that there were all type of slaves throughout history. So that's the one thing I wanted to talk about, but I want to play something for you guys to hear.
I'm here in the heart of Birmingham, Alabama, and just across the way is the 16th Street Baptist Church, where on the 15th of September 1963, Ku Klux Klan members came and decided to blow it up. And inside the church, 4 girls died. Later, Martin Luther King led a march down the streets. They were met with water cannons and dogs, and here in the park there's memorials to remember what had happened then. But I'm thinking about those who have been forgotten. Those Africans who weren't taken west to the Americas and to the Caribbean, but those Africans that were taken east into Arab lands. It's interesting that just before the start of the transatlantic slave trade in the 15th century, we see attitudes against black Africans, negative attitudes coming out of Arabia. We see Islamic scholars like Ibn Khaldun say that the Negro nations are submissive to slavery. We see other Islamic scholars like Ibn Sina, Melchizedek. We see other scholars like Al-Tabari talking about the superiority of the Arabs. We can trace actually the negative views on black people coming out of Arabia from the 15th to the 14th to the 13th to the 12th and the 9th century. In fact, scholars such as Bernard Lewis, who recently passed, has said that immediately after the death of Muhammad, we see something changing in terms of colour. You see, before the 7th century, colour was fluid. You wouldn't have black people or white people. You would have people saying, for example, I am white in contrast to this bench, or I'm black in contrast to the grey slabs. Colour was fluid. You would determine your colour by contrasting it with what was around you. But something happened in the 7th century that started to fix colour and specialise colour. And with it, there were characteristics attached to the colour. And in the case of black people, there were negative connotations to that. We also see in the 7th and 8th century, straight after Islam started, we see black people being described as Banu Ham, sons of Ham, and a reference was made back to the Torah, talking about the curse of Ham. It was a curse of blackness, they say, and they linked blackness with slavery. In fact, there isn't a curse of Ham in the Bible, there's a curse of Canaan, and it doesn't relate to the black people. But this is how it was interpreted in Islamic literature, so that Africa became a place where they would get slaves, thinking that this was the curse that Allah put on them. Scholars like Dr. John Azuma said that the black people were given the hardest and meanest work in places like Iran, where they had 500 to 5,000 people working on the soil in really difficult conditions. And so the negative attitudes to black people didn't start with the transatlantic slave trade. It was right there before, in the trans-Saharan slave trade. This slave trade went on from the 7th century all the way up until the 21st century, or the 20th century. We know that the last Arab nation, or the last nation to stop their slavery, was Mauritania in 1981. But yet last week I was in the Gambia and I heard reports of slaves working down the road belonging to Arab shopkeepers. So we know this is still going on. So whilst we still see the consequences of the transatlantic slave trade in the West and in other places, we see the legacy, we see monuments, people are making an active decision to remember and so not to repeat the mistakes of the past. But what do we find with the trans-Saharan slavery? We haven't seen one Arab nation apologize for what they did in Africa or in Europe or in India or in Asia. We haven't seen that at all. We haven't seen any monuments put up in any Arab countries. We haven't actually seen any anti-slavery movements take place. In fact, it was the British and then along other countries that forced Arab nations to stop their slave trade. It wouldn't have stopped otherwise. There's something in Christianity that acknowledges the sanctity of man because he's made in the image of God. Do we see that in the trans-Saharan slave trade? No. Because in Islam, man is not made in the image of God. In Islam, the highest status you can be is a slave. That's the highest way you can relate to Allah. He is God, you are the slave. In Christianity, we're called sons, we're called daughters. There's a relationship that can be developed, not so in Islam. Further, in Islam, you can have slaves. It's within the laws. This was one of the fights against abolition. Allah has guaranteed that you can have slaves in the right conditions. They have to be spoils of war or, passed down, inherited to you. But you can actually have slaves. And so who is anybody to say that you shouldn't have slaves? This is still the attitude in some cases, which explains why it took so long for the trans-Saharan slave trade to stop. But the question is, we know this now. Why is no one talking about it? Why is it not taught in schools? Why are we concentrating on one trade, as horrific as it was, but not also looking at the other trade, which was equally as horrific, and due to the length of time still continuing, could even be described as more horrific? So the question is this: why are the slaves that went east forgotten? Why are we not talking about this?
So as you know, I wanted to talk about the pros and cons of reparations. Here is 3 pros that I think a lot of people can agree with on reparations. This is where they believe. Addressing historical injustice. So supporters argue that reparations acknowledge and attempt to rectify the economic and social disadvantages caused by slavery and systemic racism. See, right there, a lot of people would agree with that. Because they talk about slavery, but I told you where the reparations actually started. It was the 40 acres and a mule. Economic empowerment. Financial compensation or investment in black communities could help close racial wealth gaps and provide opportunities for education, housing, and business developments. Yeah, it would, but how do the government even fund that? Like, it's crazy. And last, symbolic recognition. Reparations serve as an official acknowledgement of past wrongs, reinforcing the importance of justice and equality. Now, this I kind of agree with because, like I said, once again, it was the 40 acres and a mule, and how the government did blacks when they offered the land to them, the land, the animals, everything, and place to live, when they offered it to them and then stabbed them in the back by not paying, was a way so that they could have free labor by putting them in jail. That's an injustice that I think the government should really look into. That to me But there's a problem with that because you're going way back in today's society. You know, everybody who's here, like my parents came from South America. Where would I get reparations from? I couldn't because my family weren't from here. So see, there's so much that the government got to go through. Let's look at the cons of reparations now. Implementation challenges. Determining who qualifies for reparations and how they should be distributed is a logistical challenge. It is. Like I said, my parents came from South America. Other families come from Africa, the Caribbean, so forth. How do you know who's going to get what? And then the way things are with people not want to show ID or anything like that, it's a challenge. So that's one. Political and social division. Some argue that reparations could deepen racial tensions rather than heal them. Yes. So, like I said, everybody's been slave. So now how do you fix it when you have blacks getting all this money and the taxpayers are forking out this money out? They weren't slave owners. In fact, all they want to do, especially like whites and Hispanics and so forth, all they want to do is just live life. Why are we forcing them to pay for something that they have nothing to do with? I get that 100%. Plus, this government does not have the money to pay every black person here in America, which we're like 13% of the population. How can the government do that? And we're not talking about a couple of $100. We're talking about thousands, hundreds of thousands to maybe even millions. Cost concerns. Opponents worry about the financial burden on taxpayers and question whether reparations are the best way to address racial disparities. So yes, I talked about that because, white people and Hispanics, and they're going to be upset. Now, during the after World War II, Japanese were compensated because they were held captive because it was wartime. So that's why I think blacks are up in arms about that, and they want reparations. Once again, if you wanna argue, use something that's legit. The 40 acres and a mule. Don't talk about slavery. That's not the answer. More. Potential unfairness in distribution. Some argue that determining who qualifies for reparations is difficult as not all black Americans are direct descendants of enslaved people. Now, are my family descendants of enslaved people? Maybe. But once again, my parents came from South America. They could have been enslaved down there. I would have to argue in South America. I have no say here in America because my family roots go elsewhere. It's not from Africa right here to America. So I have no leg in this fight. Risk of economic inefficiency. Lump sum payments might not lead to long-term economic improvements and could function similarly to lottery winnings, which often do not create lasting wealth. So I'm going to be very honest with you. If you give, especially the blacks today, you give them a lump sum of money, it's going right back into the economy. Because the first thing we do, we got to get the fancy cars. We're going to buy a big house. We're going to buy all the clothes and jewelry, and we're going to blow it. We don't know how to invest. We don't think before spending, like investing in a business, maybe, no, we're going to go and spend because we love materialistic things. We don't want to save money. We don't want to invest our money. We don't want to take that chance. And a lot say they just don't trust the system. A lot say, I just don't trust the white man. You're going to lose your money. Okay. And that's why that makes a lot of sense. Alternative solutions may be more effective. Some believe that investing in education, housing, and job opportunities would be a more sustainable way to address racial disparities. Well, if you think about it, the government did do something like that. It was called welfare, and they tried their socialist program on blacks by giving them housing, food. They gave them money, and these guys was living life. In fact, up till now, it's still happening. So education, job opportunities, see, those would be great, but that's not what blacks want. They want the money. They want it right there and then. Is give it to them without any thought of, their future. Like, if I get this money, what are the smart moves that I'm going to make? You ever notice NBA players, football players, they always end up broke because they don't invest their money right. Concerns about government overreach. Opponents worry that reparations set a precedent for compensating other historical injustices, leading to ongoing financial obligations. So if we open Pandora's box and then say, okay, we're going to give you this money and we're going to give you hundreds of thousands and so forth. Well, now, Japanese could say, hey, you did compensate us, but that wasn't enough because X, Y, and Z. And so now the government got to get a committee to review that. And then you'll have the Hispanics say, well, or the Mexican, they could say, hey, during the Mexican War, so forth, this is what happened. This is what you did. The Native Americans who right now they get free healthcare. When I say free healthcare, I'm talking about they can get whatever they want and they don't pay 1 red cent. That is the truth. Native Americans pay nothing for their healthcare. 100% covered on everything. So now you can have Native Americans who get land, who've gotten their land back, money, everything like that. They can turn around and say, hey, we need more. So, this would cause a lot of problems. And I just don't see how we can really believe that reparations is a smart move. Once again, slavery that is the wrong thing. If you really want, and if you could go back in history to prove that one of your ancestors was promised land and a house, the 40 acres and a mule, was promised 40 acres and a mule and was robbed by the government, then I think they have a legitimate reason to say, hey, during this time, from this period, not from that period to right now, like from this period to that period, money was owed to my family because they were promised 40 acres and a mule, and the government stiffed them out of it. And because they couldn't pay the mortgage, they threw them in jail. That's a legitimate reason to make a complaint. Not the other crap that you hear. These fools, especially politicians, they don't know what they're saying. Like I said, if they stick with 40 acres and a mule, and it can't be all this long period, because you have to go back in time and look at from the moment when blacks were free, from the moment that the government promised them land, a home, everything like that for the crops to handle cotton, tobacco, whatever it is. They made a promise that they would purchase those goods from those free slaves, and they never did. They took it and never paid them. And that's where the fight should be. Okay?
Here, where southern rivers meet the sea, is the scene of America's first broken promise to black Americans: liberty and land. Why is land so important?
It's a way that we have control of family and control of our lives.
Historian and activist Amir Jamal Touré's family traces its ties to Georgia's Sea Islands and the Carolina Low Country all the way back to the early 1800s.
For at least 3 generations.
They weren't alone. Some 40,000 freedmen were allocated land in one of the last acts of the Civil War.
Special Field Order Number 15, better known as 40 acres and a mule.
Not just a platitude, but a promise. On General Sherman's march to the sea, as many as 10,000 newly liberated people followed the Union forces. So they're emancipated.
Yes.
But
where do we go? Where do we go?
Under pressure and facing skepticism from Washington about his own loyalties, Sherman called black pastors to his Savannah headquarters. So what is this that we're seeing?
We're seeing the meeting.
Vonette Good Walker leads the Ralph Marc Gilbert Civil Rights Museum in Savannah, home of the only illustration of the meeting.
And this is Reverend Garrison.
He was their voice.
He was the voice. He was the spokesperson for all of them.
It was Reverend Garrison Frazier's reply to Sherman that set the stage for a groundbreaking order.
What do you want? What do you want from us? And he says, we want land and we want education.
The result, Special Field Order 15 reallocated land from Charleston, South Carolina down to Jacksonville and 30 miles inland, turning the property of rice plantation Confederates over to the newly emancipated, a directive which could have changed wealth distribution for generations.
It becomes our generational wealth of being able to pass something down to our children.
Instead, it became a promise broken.
So, as you can see, those blacks, those slaves who were emancipated, were promised a lot and didn't receive it. They were scammed. The government wouldn't pay, but they took the crops, the goods, and then after that, expecting them to pay mortgage and so forth, pay for the land that they were given or so forth, or pay for taxes. And it could have been the land, it could be the taxes on the land. They could have given them the land, but then said you have to pay the taxes on the land. And then because they couldn't pay it, they end up going to jail, and whereby then they work the fields for free. So if you're going to argue something, but then even down to that is hard, because you're talking about how many years since that happened to now, and then you want to now have to go back and search to see who has rightful claim to this reparations. And once again, like I said, I can't claim it. My family's not traditionally from America. My parents came from South America, and I know on my dad's side, and from India, and my mom's side could have been in South America, it could have been some other Caribbean, could be somewhere. And who knows? However, like I said, it's a complicated situation. I truly feel at this time, I think if you're going to do compensation and you want to go back and look to see who is deserving of it, I wouldn't offer money, maybe free education, because trust me, we need some education. So I would offer free education, or maybe that thing that Kamala Harris was talking about so much down towards housing, maybe give 100 to some, maybe a discount or something on housing to purchase a house, something. But to sit down and say we're going to give you millions, because it can be up there, and who knows how many. It was a lot of emancipated blacks who were scammed. And so who knows how many it was, because they couldn't, that wealth couldn't go down through generations, because they were probably locked up or something and they weren't receiving any money. Like I said, it was a big scam that the government pulled on those free blacks. And so I say in today's time, as much as people would love to get money and so forth, I don't think that's the right way to go. I think maybe like for the ones that if you can prove down through history that this person is deserving of some type of reparations because of, the 40 acres and a mule, they should get something like free education, or housing assistance, like to purchase a home. But to give money, you're talking about to a ton. It could be a lot, and that's a lot of money, and taxpayers could not afford it. I think taxpayers would rather deal with the maybe education, because we're paying for Native Americans to get free health care, free education. I mean, they get the works. They don't have to. I remember going in with a friend of mine, and this is when I worked for a major airline. I remember going with my friend. She was a really good friend of mine, and she went to take her daughter to the hospital to see the doctor, and she was Native. And when she went in, I thought that she needed a health benefit card or something like that. No, she says, no, we don't pay anything, like 100% free. So because we are paid for that, if we're going to really look back into to say that, yes, this was an unfair justice for those emancipated individuals, then if we're going to right the wrong, then maybe education, housing assistance to purchase homes or something along that line. Let's not go into the money thing, because I feel like if you go that route, well, that's a huge burden on the government and taxpayers. Also, you're then really encouraging blacks to not really be accountable. They're going to get this money. They're going to blow it. It's going to go right back to the economy. And then next, you know, what else are you going to start saying then? And also, you're just opening Pandora's box. So I say find other ways, but with cash, no. I say let's avoid that. Okay. Well, I was glad to do this one. I'm going to make sure my brother hear this, and hopefully let's see what he has to say about it. But until then, remember, please like, subscribe, and share this video. You can also reach me at themarkperspective@gmail.com. You can leave a comment below. I will always answer it. And please feel free to ask me anything. And I hope that you guys will share this video, like it, subscribe, to help me grow my following. All right, guys. You have a good evening, and I'll talk to y'all later. Peace.